Martin Bryant's life before the Port Arthur Massacre. Childhood and family background. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7, 1967, in Hobart, Tasmania, as the first child of Maurice and Carleen Bryant. He grew up with a younger sister, and from an early age his parents and others noticed that Martin was different from other children. In a 2011 interview, Carleen Bryant recalled her son, as a young child, often broke his toys and behaved in ways she found unusual and annoying. Martin reportedly rejected normal affection even as an infant. His mother noted difficulties bonding with him, and as a toddler, he would wander off from home, sometimes being found in odd locations, far from supervision. According to one account, Carleen resorted to tethering the little boy to the front porch like a dog to prevent him from running away, an early indication of how challenging his behavior was to control. The Bryant family lived in the Hobart suburb of Lenna Valley, though they also owned a beachside cottage at Carnarvon Bay, near the historic Port Arthur site, where they spent considerable time during Martin's childhood. Maurice Bryant, Martin's father, doted on his son, but struggled to manage him. As Martin grew, neighbors and schoolmates observed that he was often isolated due to his behavior. He could be cruel to other children, and in turn other kids bullied him severely. Reports suggest Carleen sometimes kept Martin away from playmates entirely because of his rough or bizarre conduct. Within the family, Martin also tormented his younger sister, harassing her out of jealousy because she was brighter and had an easier time making friends. The Bryants knew early on that Martin was not developing like an average child, and this realization would prompt numerous professional assessments in his youth. Educational history and cognitive development. When it came time for school, Martin Bryant's developmental issues became more pronounced. By age 3, he had exhibited delays in fine motor skills and speech development, even though his gross motor milestones, like walking and running, were on time. He initially attended a local primary school. Sources indicate he was briefly enrolled at the private Friends School before transferring out, but he quickly became an outcast among classmates. Other children found his behavior odd and off-putting, and he was frequently rejected and isolated by peers. Martin, who struggled to interpret social cues, would sometimes attempt inappropriate ways of interacting. For example, one account describes him following children on their walk home and suddenly leaping upon them in a misguided attempt to befriend them. Unsurprisingly, this led to more bullying against him and further alienation. Academically, Bryant lagged far behind. He had significant learning difficulties and was described as struggling scholastically almost from the start. Teachers noted that he was disruptive in class, with a tendency toward aggressive outbursts, and that he seemed detached from reality and emotionally flat in his responses. By age 8, school authorities referred him to a child guidance psychologist due to his problematic conduct, which included torturing animals and bullying younger children. Psychological reports from this period documented a pattern of animal cruelty, such as tormenting pets or wildlife, which is a well-known red flag in child behavioral development. In August 1977, when Martin was 10, he was suspended from Newtown Primary School for his uncontrollable behavior, which reportedly included violent outbursts and targeting of vulnerable classmates. An evaluation at the Hobart Diagnostic Center around that time recorded his continued cruelty to animals and noted that he even harassed his sister at home. In response to these issues, various interventions were tried. As a child, Bryant was diagnosed as hyperactive. Doctors prescribed medication and placed him on a special dietary regimen popular at the time for treating hyperactivity, though it had little lasting effect. After his 1977 suspension and assessment, Martin returned to school in 1978 with some improvement, his aggression in class somewhat decreased following intensive efforts by his parents and specialists. Still, he continued to tease and provoke younger children, unable to fully conform to expected behavior. In 1980, at age 13, he entered Newtown High School and was placed in a special education unit to accommodate his learning and behavioral needs. Initially, he coped better in this supported setting, but as he progressed into his mid-teens, his academic performance and conduct deteriorated again. Records from his later school years show clear indications of deterioration in all aspects of his performance, including renewed instances of animal torture and classroom disruptions. Classmates and teachers continued to view him as profoundly socially impaired. Bryant left formal education in 1983, around the age of 15 to 16, without any graduation or qualifications. Upon leaving school, he underwent a pivotal psychiatric assessment that would shape his young adult life. In early 1984, Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax, a respected psychiatrist, evaluated Martin, then 16, to determine his eligibility for a disability pension. The assessment painted a bleak picture of Bryant's intellectual and emotional capacities. Dr. Cunningham Dax found that Martin was intellectually handicapped, in fact, functionally illiterate, cannot read or write, and also exhibited a disordered personality with possible signs of an emerging schizophrenic illness. Only his parents' efforts prevent further deterioration, the psychiatrist wrote, adding that Martin's parents faced a bleak future with him. On the basis of this evaluation and corroborating observations, 16-year-old Bryant was granted a government disability pension for his intellectual disability and mental health issues. Subsequent testing underscored just how severe Martin's cognitive impairments were. Over the years, he was given multiple IQ tests, which consistently placed him at the extreme low end of the spectrum. In one comprehensive assessment, forensic psychologist Ian Joblin measured Bryant's IQ at 66, roughly equivalent to the mental abilities of an average 11-year-old. This score situates Bryant on the borderline between intellectual disability and low normal intelligence, within the bottom 1 to 2% of the population. Not only did he struggle with literacy and abstract reasoning, but evaluators noted that his functional capacity in day-to-day life was limited, despite superficially appearing normal in casual conversation. For example, he could perform simple routine tasks and even travel independently, but he had great difficulty understanding complex concepts, sequencing events in a logical order, or planning ahead. His emotional maturity was also well below his chronological age. This arrested development would continue to plague Bryant's social interactions long after his school years ended. Behavioral issues and social development. From childhood into adolescence, Martin Bryant exhibited a pattern of disturbed and sometimes violent behavior that isolated him socially. Several hallmark warning signs were present. One of the most alarming was his long-standing cruelty toward animals, noted repeatedly by those who knew him. He derived pleasure from tormenting creatures. For instance, local residents recalled that as a youth, he shot at flocks of parrots in the trees near his home with an air gun, killing the birds for sport. After Martin was through, one neighbor remarked, the once abundant parrots never ever came back to the area. He likewise was reported to engage in harming cats, dogs, and other animals that crossed his path. Such behavior strongly indicates an empathy deficit and is often considered a precursor to more serious interpersonal violence. Indeed, Martin seemed to lack empathy or remorse from an early age. He would laugh or appear indifferent when others, whether animals or people, were hurt or in distress. Interpersonally, Bryant had tremendous difficulty understanding how to behave around other people. He had virtually no close friends growing up. Children who interacted with him described him as aggressive, destructive, and very difficult to get along with. He could also be impulsive and unpredictably aggressive. For example, one anecdote from his early teens recounts how Martin, at around 14, was given a spear gun by his father, and at one point he pointed it at a friend's head in jest, an incident that understandably ended that friendship on the spot. Bryant simply did not register the fear or danger such actions caused in others. Classmates who bullied him for his odd demeanor were sometimes met with Martin's violent retaliation. At least once, he ambushed a school bully with a lightning strike of force. Reports vary on specific incidents. More commonly, however, Martin was not so much physically imposing as he was socially off-putting. He often resorted to pestering those younger or more vulnerable than himself, possibly to compensate for being picked on by older kids. Teachers observed that he took delight in the discomfort and failure of other children, suggesting a cruel streak and desire for a sense of power. Bryant's odd behavior continued into adulthood, further hindering his social life. In his late teens and 20s after leaving school, he remained extremely socially isolated. Apart from his family, the one significant friend he made was Helen Harvey, an older woman, discussed in detail in the next section, who was an eccentric outsider herself. He had no peer group of his own age. Community members in Newtown, his Hobart suburb, remember Bryant as a loner who never held a job and acted strangely in public. One former neighbor, Mick Davies, recalled Martin, then in his early 20s, still hanging around neighborhood kids who were a decade younger, trying to talk to them about toys and video games like Nintendo, and not realizing how inappropriate this appeared. Davies recounted how he and the local children would spot the adult Bryant, awkwardly lurking in bushes watching them play, prompting the kids to call out, "We know you're there, Martin." The fact that Bryant, as a grown man, gravitated toward the play of children and spoke at their level, even offering a Barbie Nintendo game to trade, shows his profound social immaturity. Rather than being seen as a friendly big brother figure, he was regarded as the weird neighborhood outcast. Relationship. One of the most pivotal relationships in Martin Bryant's life was with Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, a Tasmanian woman nearly 35 years his senior. They met in early 1987 when Bryant, then 19, was looking for lawn mowing work and knocked in the door of Helen's mansion in Newtown. Helen Harvey, 54 at the time, was an heiress to the Tattersall's Lotteries fortune and lived in a decaying large house with her elderly mother, Hilza. Socially isolated herself, Helen formed an odd but close friendship with Bryant. He began visiting her frequently, ostensibly helping with chores such as caring for her collection of pets, reportedly 14 dogs inside the house and up to 40 cats in the garage. Neighbors considered Helen and Martin an eccentric pair, but their bond grew strong. In fact, Helen took a nearly familial liking to Martin and essentially adopted him as a companion. By 1991, she had even rewritten her will to name Bryant as the sole beneficiary of her estate, including her properties and a share of the lottery income, in the event of her death. This extraordinary decision suggests Helen trusted and cared for Martin deeply, despite, or perhaps because of, his peculiarities. Their life together, however, drew negative attention from the community and authorities well before the infamous Port Arthur events. The Harvey home became increasingly neglected and unhygienic due to the dozens of animals. In June 1990, an anonymous complaint prompted health authorities to intervene. Inspectors discovered Helen and her frail mother living in squalid conditions. Helen had infected ulcers on her legs, and her 79-year-old mother was found with a broken hip, both in need of urgent medical care. The authorities issued a mandatory cleanup order for the mansion. During the cleanup, the RSPCA removed many of the animals for proper care, given the obvious neglect. Martin's father, Maurice, even took leave from work to assist Helen in restoring some order to the house. It was around this time that Bryant was reassessed for his disability pension, and the caseworker's notes from 1990 offer a chilling glimpse into Martin's state of mind. Father protects him from any occasion which might upset him, as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control. This official notation clearly identified Bryant as a potential danger, yet apart from maintaining the guardianship of his affairs, discussed below, no further action was taken at the time. After the cleanup of Helen's home, events moved quickly. Helen Harvey invited Martin to move in with her at the large Newtown mansion once her mother was placed in a nursing home in 1990. Free from parental oversight for the first time and supported by Helen's wealth, Martin entered a period of extravagance. The odd duo began spending lavishly. Between 1990 and 1992, they purchased more than 30 new cars, often trading in barely used ones for newer models, and went on frequent shopping sprees for consumer goods. Their routine involved dining out for lunch daily and then indulging in afternoons of shopping, where Martin especially enjoyed buying expensive clothes and items that caught his eye. By all accounts, Bryant was like a kid in a candy store with Helen's funds at his disposal. Around this same time, his pension file was updated with another note, reinforcing the earlier warning: Father protects him as he continually threatens violence. He would like to go shooting people, underscoring that it was unsafe to let Martin be unsupervised. This warning flag would, in hindsight, look incredibly prophetic. In 1991, a new twist occurred. Due to neighborhood complaints and council restrictions, Helen was no longer permitted to keep large numbers of pets at her suburban residence. Instead of complying by scaling down her menagerie, Helen chose to relocate. She bought a 29-hectare, 72-acre farm property called Torresville in the rural township of Copping, Tasmania, and in late 1991, she and Martin moved to the farm together. Life in Copping brought Martin into conflict with new neighbors. He roamed the area with an air rifle, as mentioned, and engaged in threatening behavior that made local residents deeply uncomfortable. One neighbor recalled how Bryant would fire the air gun at tourists who stopped near the farm's apple stall, and that he even prowled at night taking shots at barking dogs. People in the small community learned to keep their distance from the weird young man on the Torresville property. Tragically, on the evening of 20th October, 1992, Helen Harvey was killed in a car accident, an event that would profoundly affect Martin's trajectory. Helen was driving Martin home from a shopping trip when her car veered into the oncoming lane and collided head-on with another vehicle. Helen, age 59, died instantly from the impact, along with 2 of her dogs that were in the back seat. Martin Bryant, then 25, was also in the car and suffered serious injuries: a fractured neck, a severe back injury, and a head injury that left him unconscious at the scene. He was pulled from the wreck alive by first responders. One eyewitness account from a man first on the scene recalled that Bryant was knocked out and bleeding, while Harvey was clearly beyond help. Martin spent over 6 months in hospital recuperating from his injuries. The car crash immediately raise suspicions due to prior incidents. It was known among Helen's friends that she drove exceedingly slowly, never above about 60 kilometers an hour, whenever Martin was in the car, because he had a nasty habit of grabbing the steering wheel while she was driving. In fact, Helen had already had 3 minor car accidents attributed to Martin lunging for the wheel, and she had confided to at least one person that one of these days the little bastard is going to kill me. Given that history, police did conduct a brief investigation into whether Martin had interfered with the vehicle on the night of the fatal crash. However, Bryant denied any wrongdoing, and no charges were filed. The crash was deemed an accident, with Martin considered another victim rather than a perpetrator. Whether Martin's behavior caused the wreck will never be definitively known. But the pattern of him grabbing the wheel, and even the timing at sunset, suggest a strong possibility that his impulsiveness led to the tragedy. In the aftermath of Helen Harvey's death, Martin Bryant became extremely wealthy by inheritance. Helen had made sure Martin was provided for. Per her will, Bryant was the sole heir to her estate. Overnight, he inherited her large farm at Copping, the substantial Harvey mansion on Clare Street in Newtown, and a significant portion of her fortune, including assets valued at over 550,000 Australian dollars. One source noted that this windfall effectively made the 25-year-old Bryant a millionaire in early 1993. However, due to Martin's well-documented intellectual impairments, his mother Carlene sought to protect these assets. She successfully petitioned for a guardianship order that placed Martin's inheritance under the management of Tasmania's public trustees, citing evidence of his diminished mental capacity. In practical terms, this meant Bryant could not freely spend down the fortune. His finances were overseen by others, with funds doled out for his needs. This step was likely influenced by the prior notes about Martin's instability. Authorities were concerned about what he might do if left with uncontrolled access to wealth. Still, even under guardianship, Bryant enjoyed the benefits of Helen's money in the form of a comfortable lifestyle and paid expenses. Around this same time, another grievous event struck the Bryant family. Maurice Bryant, Martin's father, died in 1993 in what was officially ruled a suicide. Maurice had been intensely grieving Helen's death and struggling with depression. He was on antidepressant medication and had taken an extended leave from work after Helen's accident. He had also been reportedly distressed over a long-standing disappointment. Years earlier, Maurice had attempted to purchase a local bed-and-breakfast property called Seascape, but lost the sale to another couple, David and Nolene Martin, an outcome that he lamented repeatedly to his family. On August 13, 1993, a visitor to the Bryant's Copping farm found a cryptic note on the door reading, "Call the police," and discovered several $1,000s in cash left in Maurice's car. A search party of police and volunteers scoured the farm for 2 days, with Martin himself oddly joining the search and behaving inappropriately. He tried to impress the officers with jokes and even flirted with female searchers, appearing unfazed by his father's disappearance. On August 16th, police divers finally found Maurice's body submerged in a dam on the property. He had drowned, a weighted diving belt belonging to Martin strapped around his neck like a weight sash. Eerily, investigators also found the carcasses of several drowned sheep in the dam, an unusual scene that raised some questions. Maurice Bryant's death was deemed unnatural and recorded as a suicide by drowning. The precise motivations remain unclear, but it is widely believed that despair over finances, the loss of Seascape, and the strain of dealing with Martin's future contributed to Maurice taking his own life. Martin, at 26, thus lost the 2 people closest to him, Helen and his father, within the span of a year. He also inherited a second time. Maurice left his son the entirety of his retirement superannuation fund. amounting to approximately $250,000 Australian. With this, Martin's net worth grew even more, although these funds too would fall under managed supervision. In late 1993, Bryant sold off the copping farm, Torresville, for $143,000 Australian, preferring not to maintain that property. He kept Helen's mansion in Newtown and moved back to his family home in Lena Valley for a time to convalesce from his injuries. The period from 1993 to early 1996 saw Martin Bryant adrift, wealthy, idle, and increasingly lonely. With no need to work, his investments and inherited income gave him financial security. Martin spent his days trying to occupy himself. He developed some bizarre new habits. For one, he dramatically changed his appearance and attire. Shedding the casual work overalls he used to wear on the farm, he began dressing in flashy, expensive outfits that stood out in conservative Hobart. Bryant would don a gray linen suit with a cravat, lizard skin shoes, and a Panama hat while carrying a briefcase, telling anyone who would listen that he was a high-powered businessman, a fantasy with no basis in reality. On other occasions, he showed up at a favorite restaurant wearing an electric blue suit with flared trousers and a frilled shirt, an over-the-top ensemble that drew snickers from patrons. The restaurant owner recalled feeling pity for Martin as diners laughed at him. It was clear he didn't really have any friends. Bryant seemed entirely unaware of how others perceived him, lost in a role-playing daydream of success. During this period, Martin did form one more notable relationship. He acquired a teenage girlfriend in late 1995. He met 16-year-old Petra Wilmot after placing an ad for a gardener, a somewhat ironic twist given that he rarely held jobs, and the two began dating despite their age difference. Martin was 27. Petra even moved in with him for a time. Observers, such as staff at the hotel bar where Martin liked to take her for high tea, found the pairing odd, and Martin's behavior with her disconcerting. Staff noted that Petra was quiet and that Martin's mannerisms, the same unnerving gaze and awkward profanity, made the couple stand out. It appears Petra broke off the relationship by early 1996. Notably, Martin kept his growing arsenal of weapons secret from her, hiding guns and ammunition around his house and never showing them to his young girlfriend. This concealment indicates a degree of planning and awareness on Martin's part as 1996 unfolded. Mental health evaluations and suspected conditions. 50. Throughout his life before 1996, Martin Bryant was evaluated multiple times by psychologists and psychiatrists, resulting in a complex and sometimes contradictory portrait of his mental health. The consensus was that he was profoundly impaired intellectually and socially, but there was less agreement on whether he suffered from a definable mental illness. Early assessments, as mentioned, pegged his IQ in the 60s, and Dr. Cunningham Dax's 1984 report described him as intellectually disabled and personality disordered. Dr. Cunningham Dax also raised the possibility that Martin might be developing a schizophrenic-type illness due to odd aspects of his demeanor and thinking. This was speculative, but it had an interesting ripple effect. Martin's mother, Carlene, reportedly misunderstood and began telling people and doctors that her son was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. As a result, several later medical notes, for example by Dr. Bernard Mather and Dr. P.M. McCartney in 1991, list paranoid schizophrenia in Martin's history. However, this was a misdiagnosis based on miscommunication. Bryant was never actually found to be psychotic or schizophrenic by a treating psychiatrist. It was simply that early warning that he might develop schizophrenia being recorded incorrectly, as if it were an established fact. In truth, no consistent evidence of hallucinations, delusions, or other classic psychotic symptoms ever emerged in Martin's evaluations. Years later, after his crimes, forensic psychiatrists firmly concluded that he was not mentally ill in the sense of a psychotic disorder. Other diagnoses were considered over time. As a child, Martin was effectively labeled with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or hyperactivity, given his restlessness and behavior problems. He was medicated for it briefly. In adolescence, his conduct, lying, stealing, aggression, and cruelty fit the definition of a conduct disorder, which is often a precursor to antisocial personality traits. Decades later, while awaiting trial in 1996, a court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Ian Sale, opined that Bryant's history could be understood as having shown a mixture of conduct disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity, along with the likelihood of an autism spectrum disorder, specifically Asperger's syndrome, to explain his lifelong social ineptitude. Indeed, many have speculated that Bryant was autistic or had Asperger's, given his markedly deficient social comprehension, obsessive interests, and awkward behaviors. This was never formally diagnosed in his youth. The term Asperger's was not widely used in his childhood. But notes from various assessments hinted at autistic traits, or at least severe social cognitive deficits. One 1996 forensic report, for example, mentioned that Bryant might possibly be suffering from mental retardation and autism, though these conditions were never fully confirmed or diagnosed. Another aspect frequently noted was Martin's personality profile. He was often described as immature, lonely, extremely self-centered, and prone to angry frustration when he didn't get his way. Despite occasional superficial charm or polite manners, he had a very limited capacity for emotional insight. Modern interpretations have suggested he had a personality disorder with psychopathic features, citing his lack of empathy, enjoyment of others' pain, and manipulative tendencies. Though other experts caution that he doesn't cleanly fit the model of a true psychopath so much as that of a deeply intellectually disabled man with dangerous behaviors. Crucially, forensic psychiatrist Professor Paul Mullen, who assessed Bryant for the defense in 1996, found that while Martin was a distressed and disturbed young man, he did not meet criteria for any major mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Mullen emphasized Bryant's social and intellectual impairments over any formal psychiatric diagnosis, concluding that Martin understood reality but simply had an abrasive, childlike, and callous personality formed by years of social failure. One indicator of Bryant's mental state is that after he left school and was granted the disability pension, he largely avoided further contact with psychiatric services until the events of 1996. He did not receive ongoing therapy or specialized support. The only recorded interventions in his late teen years were periodic reviews for his pension eligibility and a few visits to a general practitioner. In 1993, for instance, Martin saw his GP, Dr. Mather, complaining of anxiety and insomnia. The doctor prescribed him tranquilizers, which Martin said he took a few times a week as needed. There is no record that he was ever hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, or that any clinician recommended institutional care prior to 1996. Essentially, after the school system and initial disability assessment, Bryant fell off the mental health radar, monitored only insofar as he continued to receive pension checks. This lack of sustained intervention left him to drift through adult life with his developmental problems unchecked, aside from the structure his parents or Helen Harvey provided. Financial situation after Helen Harvey's death. The death of Helen Harvey in late 1992 thrust Martin Bryant into a vastly improved financial position, which ironically may have enabled some of his later destructive plans. As noted, Helen's will made Martin the heir to her considerable assets, estimated at over 500,000 Ashuan dollars bonds in value. This included the market value of the Copping Farm, 72 acres of land, the large house in Newtown, and presumably cash or investment holdings from her share in the Tattersall's lottery fortune. In addition, Martin was entitled to ongoing income from that lottery fortune, Tattersall's profits, effectively providing him with a substantial regular income for life. At 25 years old, Bryant suddenly had wealth far beyond anything his working-class family had ever known. However, due to concerns over his mental capacity, Martin did not gain unfettered access to all this money. In 1993, following Helen's death, Carleen Bryant, his mother, and the state's public trustee arranged for a guardianship order that placed Martin's inherited estate under professional management. His mother's move was likely well-intentioned. Martin had only the vaguest notions of finance and was highly suggestible, which could have made him a target for exploitation or allowed him to squander the fortune rapidly. Under the guardianship, Bryant received a stipend for personal use and had major expenditures controlled or approved by the trustee. For example, when Martin later decided to sell the farm property in Copping for $143,000, those proceeds would have been added to his trust rather than handed to him as cash. Likewise, the income from Helen's investments and subsequently the $250,000 from his father's superannuation payout were likely managed on his behalf. Despite these controls, Bryant lived quite comfortably. His essential needs, housing, food, medical care, were easily met by the estate. He did not have to work. His disability pension continued and was essentially supplemental pocket money compared to the inheritance. Perhaps more importantly, Martin found ways to enjoy the perks of wealth, even if he couldn't liquidate it all at once. As described earlier, he went on frequent overseas trips, which presumably the trustee allowed, paying for first-class travel and accommodations. He also indulged in material purchases. In the period living with Helen, he had bought dozens of new cars and expensive clothes, and this trend, to an extent, continued after her death, though likely at a slower pace due to the trustee oversight. For instance, in the mid-1990s, he bought and drove multiple luxury vehicles. At the time of the Port Arthur attack in 1996, he owned a yellow Volvo 244 sedan as his main car and also kept another vehicle, a blue Honda Civic station wagon, at his residence. He could afford hobbies like scuba diving. He and his father had purchased their own dive gear earlier, and the collection of firearms he would later amass. One peculiarity of Bryant's financial situation was that although he was paper-rich, his capacity to manage money was essentially nil. Psychologists remarked that monetary concepts were largely lost on him. Indeed, even before Helen's death, while they were living together, one assessment report in 1990 noted Martin had only a very rudimentary understanding of finance, which partly prompted the recommendation that he not be given too much autonomy. After Helen's estate came under trustee control, Martin would sometimes become frustrated that he was not in charge of his windfall, but he lacked the wherewithal to challenge the legal setup. In practice, his mother Carleen continued to de facto control many aspects of his life. For example, she remained heavily involved in decisions like selling the farm, and she monitored his activities as best as she could. Nevertheless, Bryant's newfound wealth did significantly enable his lifestyle in ways that had consequences. It gave him the means to travel widely, which in turn exposed him to events like the Dunblane School Massacre in Scotland, March 1996, an event that reportedly fascinated him and, according to his psychiatrist Paul Mullen, perhaps changed everything by giving him a dark model to emulate. His wealth also provided the funds to acquire weapons and large quantities of ammunition, discussed in the next section, with relative ease. He could simply pay in cash. And having substantial savings may have fed into Bryant's sense of grandiosity or invulnerability. He often spoke of plans for grand purchases or business ventures that were unrealistic, yet the fact that he had money in the bank might have reinforced his delusional self-confidence. In summary, after Helen Harvey's death, Martin Bryant was a young man with an unsupervised daily life and hundreds of thousands of dollars at his disposal, albeit managed on paper by a trustee. Those funds removed any economic necessity that might have structured his time or brought him under closer social scrutiny. For example, he never held a job where odd behavior might have been noticed by employers. Instead, he lived in comfort, further detached from normal socializing, and was able to privately prepare for the horrific actions he eventually chose to undertake. Acquisition of firearms, despite his background. One of the most troubling aspects of Martin Bryant's pre-1996 life is how he was able to legally acquire a small arsenal of firearms, despite his well-known history of psychological problems and the fact that he did not hold a gun license. In the early to mid-1990s, gun laws in Tasmania, and Australia generally, were far more lax than they would become post-Port Arthur. At that time, there were no requirements for firearm registration in Tasmania, and no special restrictions on mentally impaired individuals purchasing guns. As long as a person had money and access to a seller, they could obtain even high-powered firearms with minimal oversight. Bryant exploited this environment to arm himself to the teeth. Evidence later revealed that Martin Bryant began stockpiling weapons shortly after coming into his inheritance. The timing is notable. After his father's suicide in August 1993, Bryant suddenly had even more cash at hand, and by late 1993, he made his first major gun purchase. In October or November 1993, he responded to a newspaper classified advertisement in Tasmania and purchased an AR-10 semi-automatic rifle, an Armalite .308 caliber rifle, from a private seller. Private sales at the time did not necessarily require any background check or license verification, so a simple cash transaction would suffice. Bryant's AR-10 was a military-style weapon capable of firing rapidly and with great lethality. It was an ominous acquisition for a young man who had previously been noted to fantasize about shooting people. Over the next few years, Bryant quietly added to his collection. He bought gun bags and cases, ammunition, and other accessories from local gun shops, arousing little suspicion. For instance, in early 1996, he visited a Hobart firearms dealer and inquired about purchasing a Colt AR-15 SP1, a semi-automatic .223 caliber rifle, the civilian version of the U.S. military's M16 rifle. The shop told him an AR-15 could be ordered for about $3,000. Bryant did not buy it on the spot from that store, possibly because he lacked the required license or permit there. However, he managed to obtain an AR-15 elsewhere shortly thereafter, likely through another private sale or a trip to another state with looser enforcement, and this AR-15 would tragically be one of the guns he used during the Port Arthur Massacre. In addition to rifles, Bryant also acquired at least one 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. Police believe he bought a shotgun in early 1996, as he purchased cleaning kits for a 12-gauge around that time. He would later admit that the recoil of that shotgun frightened him when he fired it, indicating he did test out his weapons before the massacre. Astonishingly, Martin Bryant did all of this without ever holding a firearms license or any formal authorization. At the time, Tasmanian law allowed ownership of many types of rifles without registration. And a license, while technically required for some categories of guns, was easy to bypass through private sales or by simply not declaring one's purchases. Bryant took advantage of these loopholes. In one documented instance, he brought his AR-10 rifle to a gun shop in March 1996 for repairs, and no report was made to police. It was returned to him, indicating the shop either didn't ask for proof of license or overlooked it. He also was able to buy large quantities of ammunition freely. During a police interview, investigators asked Bryant if a shop owner ever inquired about him having a gun license when he bought ammunition. He replied, "No, I never discussed it. I just said I had the cash on me, and he said that's all right." This illustrates how cash and carry sales of ammo, and by extension guns, were readily accepted by some sellers who did not enforce regulations. Essentially, nothing in the system flagged or stopped Bryant from arming himself because he had no criminal record and no official history of being institutionalized as mentally ill. His background, intellectual disability, and hints of violence was known to medical and welfare authorities, but not shared with gun sellers, and legally it would not have disqualified him from gun ownership under Tasmanian law at the time. By April 1996, Martin Bryant had accumulated an arsenal that included the Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, the AR-10 semi-automatic rifle, a military-style FN/FAL, also referred to as an L1A1 SLR, semi-automatic .308 rifle. This was another weapon he had access to, and a 12-gauge shotgun, among others, plus hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He hid these weapons around his house, going so far as to conceal some inside the hollowed interiors of 2 pianos he owned. He kept his guns secret from the people he lived with or spent time with. For example, as noted, his then-girlfriend Petra was entirely unaware that he had any firearms in the house. In hindsight, Bryant's ability to amass such a cache seems shocking given his profile, but it starkly demonstrates the lax firearms climate of pre-1996 Australia. One local Tasmanian resident reflected that before the Port Arthur Massacre, everyone had guns. There was no tracking of it, nothing. It was not unusual even for households in semi-rural areas to have an unregistered semi-automatic rifle for shooting pests, obtained casually off a mate. Martin Bryant's case was a catalyst for change. Only after his rampage did Australia implement strict nationwide gun laws, the 1996 National Firearms Agreement, which now prevent individuals with histories like his from legally obtaining weapons. But prior to that, Bryant operated under the radar. As the Tasmanian Supreme Court's Chief Justice would later summarize, Bryant owned and used military-style semi-automatic weapons, but did not hold a license or any kind of authority for them. There was simply no effective system to stop him. Warning signs and missed opportunities for intervention. Looking at Martin Bryant's life before the Port Arthur Massacre, numerous warning signs emerge in retrospect. Red flags that, had they been acted upon, might have led to interventions potentially preventing the tragedy. Below is a summary of the key warning signs and missed opportunities. Early childhood red flags. Bryant's abnormal behavior was evident from a young age. He was cruel to animals, aggressive toward other children, and nearly uncontrollable at school. These are classic warning indicators for future violence. Despite being suspended and sent for psychological assessments as a child, these interventions only resulted in a disability pension. There was no long-term therapeutic strategy or special supervision put in place beyond placing him in special education. Once he left school, he effectively fell through the cracks of the system, free to continue his troubling behavior unchecked. Explicit threats of violence. Perhaps the most glaring missed warning was the note recorded by the welfare officer in 1990 during his pension review, which stated that Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people and deemed it unsafe to allow Martin out of pattern of animal torture. Bryant's penchant for torturing animals was documented in school reports and psychiatric evaluations. Animal cruelty is strongly correlated with future interpersonal violence. Despite this knowledge, Martin was never prosecuted for animal cruelty, which could have brought him to the attention of law enforcement and possibly mandated counseling. Family and neighbors mostly kept these incidents quiet or handled them informally. For instance, his father responded by gifting him firearms, air guns, perhaps hoping to channel his aggression into productive outlets like hunting, a strategy that backfired by further desensitizing Martin to killing living things. Social isolation and odd behavior. Many people who encountered Bryant found him strange, unsettling, or frightening, be it schoolmates, neighbors, or shopkeepers. Yet, the culture at the time was to simply avoid or mock him, rather than report him. Neighbors in Copping chose to steer clear, at all costs. Waitstaff in Hobart just felt uncomfortable, but didn't notify anyone in authority about his eccentric conduct. His one brief romantic partner was a minor, 16 years old, when he was 27, which today might raise concerns, but it apparently did not lead to any official scrutiny then. In short, Bryant's social withdrawal and bizarre actions set off informal alarm bells, but these did not translate into formal interventions. The community viewed him as the local oddball, not as a potential mass murderer, a grave underestimation in hindsight. Dangerous driving incidents. Multiple incidents indicated Bryant posed a danger in vehicles, grabbing Helen Harvey's steering wheel and causing accidents. Helen herself voiced fear that Martin's antics would get her killed. Despite at least 3 known minor crashes from his interference, there's no record of authorities taking action, such as revoking Martin's ability to ride along unless restrained, or pursuing charges for endangering public safety. When Helen ultimately died in the 1992 crash, police suspected Martin's role but accepted his denial. This can be seen as a missed opportunity to investigate deeper. If, for example, Martin had been found legally responsible for causing that crash, even through recklessness, he might have faced serious consequences or monitoring well before 1996. Suspicious death of Maurice Bryant. Martin's father's suicide in 1993 was officially not attributed to Martin, but some aspects, the cryptic note, the weight belt, drowned sheep, were unusual. If there were any suspicions of foul play, or if Martin's bizarre behavior during the search was considered, it wasn't pursued. The death was ruled a suicide, and with it, any chance that authorities might have used the event to mandate a psychological reevaluation of Martin was lost. After his father's death, Martin was essentially living without any close supervision. His mother lived separately much of the time, and no check-ins beyond financial trustees, which gave him freedom to plan and act in dangerous ways. Ease of obtaining firearms. Perhaps the most consequential systemic failure was that nothing legally prevented Martin Bryant from arming himself to the extent that he did. Despite his obvious red flags, he remained a licensed driver. Ironically, he did drive cars even though he had no license, another law he flouted unnoticed, and, more critically, an eligible gun buyer. The fact that a young man on a disability pension for intellectual impairment could anonymously purchase high-powered firearms through advertisements and casual sales is a stark illustration of a missed preventative measure. Before 1996, there was no background check or mental health clearance required in Tasmania to purchase most guns. Bryant's case became the prime example of why that needed to change. It is telling that within weeks of the Port Arthur Massacre, Australian lawmakers instituted sweeping gun reforms that likely would have flagged and barred someone like Martin from obtaining guns had they been in place earlier. The massacre itself was the catalyst that exposed how the system had failed to connect the dots. A person with a known history of violent ideation and cruelty was able to legally equip himself with military-grade weapons. In conclusion, Martin Bryant's life before the Port Arthur Massacre is a tragic story of warning signs overlooked or unheeded. From childhood through his teenage years and into young adulthood, there were clear indicators of his troubled development: severe cognitive limitations, aggressive and cruel behavior, fantasies of violence, and social ostracism. Various institutions, schools, medical professionals, social services, did take note of these problems, yet no concerted intervention succeeded in reforming or containing him. Crucially, the combination of his social isolation and unfettered access to money and guns in his 20s created a volatile situation. Those closest to him, like his parents and Helen Harvey, tried to manage him in private ways, but even they underestimated how dangerous he could become. The missed opportunities, such as failing to follow up on explicit threats or to restrict his access to firearms, stand out in hindsight. Unfortunately, it took the horror of April 28, 1996, to reveal just how many warning signs had been present and how lethal the consequences were when they went unaddressed. Each facet of Bryant's pre-massacre life, from his difficult childhood to the deadly arsenal he amassed, now serves as a sobering lesson in the importance of early intervention and robust safety nets for individuals exhibiting violent and abnormal behavior.